Well, hello, Philadelphia. This is Paul Brown, and it is always personal in Philadelphia. And today I'm talking to my man, Dr. Momir Parham. Dr. Mo, please introduce yourself to Philadelphia.
Yes, welcome Philadelphia. We're here again working through this tragic time together. So thank you again for having me on the show, Paul
No
Brown.
problem. No problem. And we aim to ignite critical thinking with an objective perspective on issues that affect marginalized Americans on this podcast. And today I invited Dr. Mo to talk to us about psychosis. And we have a number of issues that we as Americans, we're seeing 89,000 passed away from COVID-19, a million plus infected. We're seeing our government favor the wealthy and ignore the marginalized Americans. We're seeing a healthcare system that's crumbling and also a government that's crumbling right before our eyes. We're also seeing African Americans being gunned down at an alarming rate in our nation. And the reason why I wanted to have Dr. Mo on this segment today to cover psychosis, because I feel like we're currently in a dream state, and I don't feel many people are talking about mental health the way we should be. I have, a few questions for our audience before we even engage with this conversation. And I'm wondering if money and transportation wasn't an issue, would you put mental health at your top priority list? Should you only go to a doctor when your illness is life-threatening? And the third question I want the audience to really think about is, can a government suffer from psychosis? I think I invited the perfect guest for this conversation. And Dr. Mo, you are a psychologist professor, correct?
Right.
And how long have you said it took about 10 years for you to even become a psychiatrist in general, correct?
Well, it took a total of about 20 years of total teaching, educating, learning, re-licensing, licensures and all those good things, but a sum of 20 years total.
And your study is of the brain, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and you are a scientist as well as a doctor in your profession.
Correct.
So you're the perfect person to talk to about psychosis.
Yes. So what I like to share first and foremost about the whole concept of psychosis, I like to first begin with the notion that during the COVID-19 time, the reason why I think it's important to have this discussion is because the media and all sorts of platforms have been vehicles to inform us about the continuation of how COVID-19 has impacted us. And so a lot of the discussions are around the economy, around vaccinations, around what we're going to do next once we reopen our states, et cetera. But there's very little discussion about how our mental hygiene has been plummeting and how many times people are suffering depression, suffering major mental disorders as a result of COVID-19. And so as we go into this concept of psychosis, one thing I want to stress is that COVID-19 is the vehicle that is being utilized to unveil what's actually happening in our minds when we're forced to slow down. And so when we're forced to slow down, we're then forced to be able to look and see and sit with things that we typically wouldn't be able, or typically not willing to sit down with, because everyday life has us running. Mm-hmm. Well, since the city and states are closed down, we're then forced to look at issues, problems, and deal with mental issues that we probably wouldn't have dealt with as quickly as we probably would be willing to, but COVID-19 has slowed us down. And so what I want to talk to the audience about today as we unpack this is very layered. We're going to speak in the abstract. We're not going to speak primarily just in the clinical, because psychosis is actually a symptom of an illness. It's not the actual illness. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that's very, very clear. Mm-hmm. Psychosis is the actual symptom of an issue or illness that may be unfold, meaning if you have depression, one of your illnesses symptoms is psychosis. Okay, so the concept of we're talking about a symptom for the duration of our conversation. But we have to also understand for the audience that if you're experiencing any sort of psychosis, which all of us in some shape, way, and form have, it's actually attached to a larger issue. And so for disclaimer purposes, of course, I would have to sit down with you and assess, but we're speaking in general, right? We're speaking in frames and concepts around what it could be if you experience psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. And what is psychosis?
So psychosis is a symptom that impacts one's mind in terms of how they think, how they perceive certain scenarios, and it impacts your behavior, the way you process information, and how you engage. And so with psychosis, it puts you into a place of you're impaired because you're not evaluating processes as you would typically if you were not under psychosis. And so the bottom premise that one needs to walk away with is that it actually impacts the way you differentiate what's actually occurring and what's not occurring. Psychosis pushes one to live in a space of hallucinations, pushes a space that a person lives in untruths, pushes a person to live from the perspective of occurrences that they see that may not actually be real. So it really manipulates how you distinguish truth from reality.
Okay. It sounds like psychosis is somewhat of a dream state.
Yes.
Okay.
So you could put it in another term. It can put you in a dream state, but it also, one would say it's not a dream, it's more so of a nightmare.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you mentioned that because I have a reoccurring nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
And it's me in an uncontrolled car. Basically, it's almost like someone who is paralyzed from the neck down in a car going 90 miles per hour. And I can't control the steering wheel. It's out of control. I can't do anything. I can't put my foot on the brakes. I can't do anything about the situation but just be along for the ride. So I'm happy we're talking about psychosis because during this time, COVID-19, we're all basically in isolation.
Yeah.
And I think we spoke of it before where we're pretty much all practicing mindfulness to some degree, right?
Well, mindfulness takes intentionality, and so that the assumption would be those who are practicing healthy mental hygiene is actually adopting the act of mindfulness. But that's not an assumption that I think most Americans are practicing at this time.
Okay. And with that being said, we should be practicing mindfulness and analyzing your thoughts because when I have this reoccurring nightmare, the one thing I come to realize is that when I'm conscious, I can take full control of my whole entire environment. I won't be in the car that's out of control. I can actually control my reality. I control the things around me. I can speak to my neighbors. I can try to cultivate a community. I can try to educate people, and I can try to steer this car in the proper path and have full control over it. However, I feel as if people around us need to start practicing mindfulness because we need to wake people up and get out of this dream state because we have a lot going on right now in our nation. And we need to wake each other up at this very moment so we can get all hands on deck.
Absolutely. And so when you start to take the idea of waking, the concept of waking persons up, what you then start to do is you're not only waking up positive things that need to be awakened, but you're also waking up those monsters that people kind of cohabitate with. And so when we talk about the idea of waking one up, you need to have the right tools and you need to have the right people to help facilitate the awakening process. Because the idea of mindfulness takes the idea that you have to be intentional about focusing on things that uplift, focusing on things that bring you peace, focusing on things that keep the mind still. And when the mind is still, all sorts of thoughts begin to travel through your psyche, both good and bad, right? And so mindfulness is making a decision that when those thoughts are passing through, I will wear the good ones, and then the negative ones, I'll push those along the trail so they don't stop and find residence in my mind.
Mhm.
So the act of mindfulness is saying, I want all things that are healthy for my brain. I want all things that are healthy for my peace. So then on a practical level gets into, I don't want to watch the news 24/7. Maybe I want to listen to some music, some
Mhm.
peaceful instrumental music, and sit and just listen to nature. Maybe I just want to journal. Maybe I just want to listen to music with words that are encouraging. So it's taking all your activities and assessing whatever I do, will this contribute to peace? Will this contribute to my mind being healthy? Or will this contribute to my mind being in full anxiety?
Mhm.
So the idea of that, it's an art and science. And, to say, hey, Americans practice this, people are in fear, people are in anxiety, and that's where therapists like myself and counselors and psychologists who come alongside people to say, let me give you the tools to be able to do this. That's why I think your questions in the beginning is so important for your audience to process and think through, because mental hygiene during COVID-19 or during any pandemic or any type of, tragedy that were happening, how you respond is the most important piece. You can't control what's going to happen. None of us are in control of COVID-19. None of us are in control of how this is going to unfold. But what we can control is how we respond to it.
Completely agreed.
The art of
Complete.
mindfulness helps with that.
I agree with that because when I practice mindfulness or the art of mindfulness, it basically tells me to go and continue to make masks for my neighbors,
Mm-hmm.
to plant victory gardens in response to food shortages, to encourage my neighbors to do the same, to actually respond to it in a way that's going to be self-sustaining. I hope that we can actually get our audience to
Mm-hmm.
practice mindfulness in a way it encourages them to engage in their communities and take full control of the steering wheel right now.
Absolutely. That's why I think one of the other roots to psychosis is the act of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And fear is false evidence appearing real. And what happens with the idea of fear, it begins to force you to postulate that certain things are there. That's why I said hallucinations, or you go into places where you have this kind of, you're seeing things in the world. And after a while, if you was to watch the news for 24 hours a day,
Mm-hmm.
and the news is spewing out, all right, so let's get more practical here. Let's talk about race relations from a cultural perspective.
Mm-hmm.
If I was a person who was of the Caucasian descent,
Mm-hmm.
and relatively my community is predominantly of Caucasian descent, and my workplace is Caucasian descent, and everything that I associate with primarily is Caucasian descent. When it comes to other cultural communities, the only intersection that I have with those cultural communities is via the news. And so if the news begins to spew out all this negative information or perpetuate themes and patterns that a certain culture, let's just say for this example, people of color are, dangerous or violent or, about something that is not positive, I begin to get that in my psyche
Mm-hmm.
that I'm seeing patterns here. The news is clearly providing information that these certain target populations cannot be trusted.
Mm-hmm.
And so remember, if I'm already now dealing with depression, or I'm already dealing with schizophrenia, or I'm dealing with post-traumatic stress from another event,
Mm-hmm.
a symptom would be psychosis. And so what happens is that as a result of my mind already being stricken from the impact and effects of my depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, I then go into psychosis and I begin to hallucinate. And I then begin to create a paradigm by which what I see isn't necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
But in my mind, it is true because I'm sick. I'm mentally not well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I then begin to make up scenarios and I begin to postulate certain things about what I'm seeing. And then the example that I provided is people of color. I began to say, they are violent, they are dangerous. And in my mind, I already saw them kill a lot of white people. It didn't actually happen. But in my psychosis, it did.
Mm.
In my psychosis, it's real. I've hallucinated that that is true. Think about it. Psychosis is actually the symptom. What causes psychosis is actually the illness.
Mm-hmm.
So an untreated illness causes psychosis.
Mm.
If you haven't treated your depression, if you haven't treated your anxiety, if you haven't treated your hallucinations that may perhaps schizophrenia or bipolar disorder causes, then what you do go into a 3-tier system of psychosis. The first tier of psychosis would be what they call postrum. And postrum is you start to go into this process by which your behavior starts to change. You're not sure how this is impacting you, I should say, but your behavior starts to change. Then you go into a second stage, which is acute. And that is when you're really dead into psychosis. It's where the hallucinations and your delusions really kick in full effect, where you probably need medical attention. You probably need medicine to treat those hallucinations because they're side by side with schizophrenia, bipolar. And once you're treated, hopefully you'll go into stage 3, which is recovery. And recovery is then where those hallucinations, those false observations that are kind of engineered in your brain begins to lessen. You begin to live with them. You have them here and there, but it's not as acute or it's not as cumbersome as it would be before. So in those 3 effects, this is kind of how the idea of psychosis can unfold: postrum, acute, recovery. And what we really want to move people from is that when we notice they're actually in postrum, we start to treat them right away. Unfortunately, what happens is that most people don't know that's what's really happening to them. So then they matriculate to acute. And when they're in acute, they're in a really serious place because things, the hallucinations and the seeing things and forcing people or coaches to be the villains, that isn't a sign of acute psychosis. We want to get you to recovery so we can get you back to good mental healthy hygiene and back to stableness where you can kind of move out of those kind of observations, if that makes sense.
It does. So a lot of times, I believe you mentioned in the past to bring someone from the trauma they experienced to the here and now.
So is the concept, what we do sometime in psychotherapy is moving the you from then and there, where the trauma happened, to here and now. And most of our times, we're addicted to rehearsing our pain. When you speak with someone and you say, hey, Paul, tell me what happened to you. Some of us can re-articulate that traumatic occurrence as if it happened today and it happened years ago. And so what we want to do is move you out of that space, because some of us mentally can be stuck. We can be stuck in the then and there. I want to move you to a healthy place of here and now, that this happened to you. You are not that occurrence. It happened to you, but that's not who you are. I want to get you to the here and now. And here and now means you're in a clean slate where you can start again.
And now with that being said, I want to talk to our YouTube family out there. If we were to look at our nation from its inception, and we look at the treatment of natives, we look at the treatment of African Americans who were brought from a whole different continent here to be made slaves. We look at the treatment of a lot of the Asians who built the railroad and all the marginalized Americans that had to endure and suffer. Our nation here and now is falling apart at the seams. All that suffering, for the most part, has never truly been addressed for all of the marginalized groups in America. And as a result, I personally see us in psychosis. I'm not sure if you feel the same way, Dr. Mo. Considering all the previous traumas, if you were to look at a person with this type of trauma or this type of behavior where they're hyper aggressive or the illusions are you oppress people or a
Mm-hmm.
certain sect of people, and that when they enter your society, the illusion is that they are dangerous to society as a whole.
Sure.
Uh, if you were to look at the fact that our nation dealing with COVID-19, their response is to be secular and not work with the World Health Organization. The illusion is that we as a nation don't need another nation at all. If that were a person who were exhibiting that type of behavior, hyper aggressive, hallucinations, paranoid to the max, demonizing individuals, how would you go about trying to diagnose someone like that? Would that be a symptom of psychosis?
Sure. So what you identified is several symptoms to a major illness.
Mhm.
And so the first process would be to sit down with the individual to kind of walk them through how some of these symptoms are, making them clearly unbalanced. And one of the symptoms would be psychosis as a result of, when you said hallucinations, super paranoid, psychosis, those are symptoms to a greater issue. And so, in therapy, again, you were bridging the idea from COVID-19 to this oppressed population. To a certain degree, you know, we're all we're all dealing with this in different ways.
Mhm.
And so I want to make sure that we're clear that there are those who are clinically depressed, clinically have anxiety disorder that needs to be treated. And then there are also those of us who have what we have seasons or moments of depression or anxiety. So if we differentiate that, we've all experienced moments of depression or anxiety or psychosis. Those, and I wouldn't say necessarily healthy, but those are more common. On the other hand of it, we're talking about someone who is clinically depressed,
Mhm.
clinically has anxiety issues, someone who's in a trance where, as a result of being clinically depressed or filled with anxiety, has clinical experiences, clinical major experience with psychosis,
Mhm.
where they actually need to be treated for their hallucinations, treated for the mental or the chemical imbalance that they're experiencing.
Mhm.
So, in the long short of the answer is that the person would definitely need to have, therapy. They would need to go through major therapy to kind of get a balance in terms of how they operate.
Okay. I'm happy you said that because right now I'm seeing, from my perspective, a breakdown of our government
Oh,
in every capacity. And so right now, when your government collapses, the people need to start building their communities, and the people need to start waking each other up and trying to find different ways to connect, in my personal opinion. Our nation, for a long period of time, whites and blacks have horrible relationships as it relates to racism in America. Again, we're seeing blacks being gunned down at an alarming rate. We're seeing people suffering at an alarming rate. What I oftentimes see from our government is a lack of empathy, a lack of ability to connect, to even put themselves in someone else's shoes. And as a result, when we see young men get gunned down directly after a march on Michigan State Capitol, and you see people voicing their frustrations at a state when it's really their federal government that's the major issue. They'll be hyper aggressive towards their common citizens because they're a different race or a different culture or a different religious background. That to me looks like a nation that is experiencing symptoms of psychosis in general. And that's why I think this conversation is really important, because it illustrates why we as a nation and individuals need to hit mental health at our top of our priority list.
yeah, I agree.
You literally have to wake up around you and try to practice mindfulness in a way that's going to get you engaged
Yeah,
to help your individual citizens, because your government is not right now. It's collapsing right before your eyes.
absolutely. And you can see the big war that they're having where mental health practitioners do not agree with the scientists and the biologists. And the biologists and scientists and mental health practitioners don't agree with the economists who are basically, given a perspective or recommendation from their perspective, which is we need to get people back reinserted into the economy generating models because we need to make money. We need to turn the economy around. The mental health folks will say, listen, people are mentally, they're not well. They are not well. This is not a good time to send anybody back to work. It's not a good time to send anybody. And so they have their recommendations. And then you have the biologists and the scientists in terms around the epidemic and the vaccine, where they're saying, well, we can open up the country, but there needs to be these certain phases, because if not, we're going to be right back to where we started. And so then we're thinking about, oh, now what's morphing out of all of these different concepts is that, oh, wow, well, at the end, who's going to get the short end of the stick? Well, with any epidemic and any other issue, who else gets the short end of the stick? The disenfranchised, the underserved, the inner cities, the minority communities bear the brunt and burden of issues that start from the top and trickle all the way down. And this model and these instances have occurred so many years. It's happened the same way over and over and over. So from a mental perspective, you're a person of color. This is not a, can you practice mindfulness? It is, audience, either physically die or remain alive and be dead in the inside and numb. Because at this point, from what you're seeing, is so unhealthy for anyone with, the idea of trying to practice mindfulness. You'll be sick. I'm in the health profession. I am charged to help people get free and healed mentally. And I too have to also be intentional about I'm a practitioner where I'm helping people to get healed and identify the issues so that they can get back to balance and wellness. But I'm also a man of color, where I have to then also manage my own mortality by practicing the safe protocols to make sure that I'm not impacted. And now we go down a little deeper to say, well, that's not enough. Because you can practice the safe protocols. You can go to the right schools. You can do the right thing. You could be obedient, and you could be simply just jogging and be shot down, killed. You don't think that mentally has an impact on us, where we're basically saying, no, it's not. We went from a stage where if you do the wrong thing, or we know we can't do certain things, to you can actually just be sitting in your living room and you can come out on your own patio and they shoot you dead. That does something to one's psyche. So one mentally, that causes more stress on top of the stress that we have already, which is, not having enough economics, or managing our families, or trying to make ends meet, or not sure if you're employed or underemployed or unemployed, etc. So this adds an extra layer that certain cultures, i.e. white cultures, may not have to worry about. So I go back to say, practicing mindfulness is not a question. It's, for me as a practitioner, it's an urgent demand that I really want our audience to look into the deeper idea of, it's either swim or sing. We as a people either swim or sing. Before we can even get to the issues, we got to handle our mental hygiene. We have to get mentally sound about what we need to do for ourselves, because what's in the underpinnings in our psyche is very, very unhealthy. There's a lot of functional, unhealthy people that need help. And if I could be a part of breaking the norm or the misnomer that therapy and counseling are for, those who have the money or have the insurance, or you only go when there's something wrong, it's really killing our culture. So we have some inner, the whole framework that I'm thinking, even from a mental health or just kind of thinking about solutions, I think those are you're kind of in solution mode in terms of things that we can do. I think that one of the greatest solutions that we need to process is that I think of this framework from how I was my upbringing. And so there's the concept that, you ever know, like Paul, so if you and I were brothers and we go out to the streets and something happens, you and I are brothers. So out there in the streets, no matter what happens to you, I'm responsible and accountable to you. You're
Right.
my brother. Now, you're not going to always do the right thing. But at the end of the day, I still have a certain loyalty. I have a loyalty to you because you're my brother. Now, when we get home, we're going to have some discussions because you could have put me in jeopardy. You could have put my life in jeopardy. You could have been the wrong one who was in the situation, but I'm not going to do that out in front of the situation that we're having. I think that what I'm trying to point out is that we have some in-house discussions that we need to have as people of color.
Yes. Yes.
And these are things that usually happen at the table that there's no table. In fact, there is no place or atmosphere in our homes to have these discussions because we're separated. But the idea of unity, what you talked about solutions, we're not unified.
Right.
And so all these grassroots movements that you're referring to is people getting together to say, no, we're not waiting for the government. We're going to come together and create a movement ourselves. And this movement's going to push government to answer us because we're all collectively regurgitating the same narrative that we're not going to take anything less. And if not, we'll support each other. That's not happening. And so all of these different grassroots are moving here, and it's not a collective strategy to execute on something to say, you know what, we're not waiting for Trump or any of those folks to formulate or customize a plan that works for people of color. That's why I think the bigger discussion, and not to get into politics, audience, but we need to ask the question, so what is the plan for people of color? To any leader, be it Biden or Trump or what's the gentleman that dropped out? Excuse me, audience.
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders. It just needs to be a plan. But even as those politicians list out a plan, we need to do a better job of coming together to create a plan that works for our communities, and that's not happening.
And
so,
go ahead. No, continue, please finish that thought.
So I'm just saying, just from a mental hygiene perspective, it even starts there. That I say to you, all right, from on a really myopic level, when I come home from a long day of work, who am I talking to? Who can I come and talk to say, I have X, Y, and Z going on with me? If I say this to my wife or girlfriend, that might be too much for her. I don't want to share with, my brothers because they're going through the same thing. They don't have anything to give me. And then it impairs my ability to be able to lead and stretch my community because I'm so inundated with my own stuff.
Facts.
And that's why therapy, counseling, and getting together is very, very important. Back to the mental hygiene piece, but go ahead.
It's actually really powerful that you said that, because before you can even try to come to a solution in general, you have to address the fact that most of your community hasn't even acknowledged the original suffering that they have, or even come to a collective agreement on what their solution should be as a collective. And, again, we have a subset of people in our nation, African Americans, who've been suffering since this nation's inception. We've never really come together to figure out what we truly need to get ourselves together. And the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you about psychosis is because what you're saying, what I'm interpreting you're saying, is we have to originally address the trauma that we're suffering, our symptoms, our immediate symptoms.
Yes, we have to address the illness, not just the symptoms. See, this is what medical practitioners, this is what we do, unfortunately. And I'll take responsibility in that too. We treat symptoms. We're not interested in healing you at the root. You have a headache, I'll give you something for a headache. You have some trauma, I'll give you a pill for your anxiety. You have some depression, I'll give you a pill for your depression. But the real true therapy comes in, let's treat the illness. Let's get to the root of what's causing your depression, what's causing your anxiety. And so we take that same framework, the same idea for people of color, which is there's a bunch of symptoms that we're seeing in our communities, right? You look around, there's a plethora of symptoms, but no one is actually looking at the illness. We have a lot of mental illness in the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of anxiety in the Black community.
And I personally feel like our nation is suffering from psychosis. A symptom is suffering from psychosis. Now,
Absolutely.
we're seeing it, right? You mentioned post-traumatic stress as memory of traumatic events.
Mm-hmm.
We're constantly being reminded that we are subhuman.
After a while, that narrative begins, as it perpetuates itself, that our lives don't matter. I don't care the strongest. If something begins from the psychology of it, if something begins to perpetuate itself, subconsciously, you start to believe it.
Mm-hmm. So now we have our mission.
Self.
Say again. Say that one more time.
Part of manifestation in the self, repetition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as you can repetitively hear or observe or see in examples upon examples upon examples that your life doesn't matter, in your psyche, you begin to make decisions as if your life doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. You don't plan as if your life doesn't matter. You don't carry yourself as if your life doesn't matter. This is why mindfulness is important. Because mindfulness interrupts that narrative that your life doesn't matter. Even though this is perpetuating, I'm intentionally refocusing my mind away from the very thing that's killing me to the very thing that's going to give me life. That's why I said swim or sink. If you don't practice it, you're going to be caught up because it's going to get worse, Paul. This is going to get worse. What happened to the young man who was shot dead? That's just an example of what continues to happen. And it's going to get worse. If I continue to believe in that, I'm not going to be any good mentally for my family, for my communities, for the workplace, etc., because I'm so inundated with the narrative that my life doesn't matter. No matter how much education I get, no matter how well I do, no matter how articulate I am, my life doesn't matter. So if Mo, let's just say me, if I believe that, then at the end of the day, what's the point?
We have to get out of that mentality and develop our own self-worth as a unit, as a people, and realize that we are in a nation suffering from psychosis. Your nation has put you in this predicament. And it's for us to change that narrative, to change how you even engage with your neighbors. You have to uplift them. You have to say hi to your neighbors, speak with them, connect with them in some way or fashion. Call your neighbor a king, call your neighbor a queen. Constantly do that. Constantly challenge your neighbors to increase their self-worth and practice mindfulness every day.
Yeah.
Just meditation. Is that mindfulness? Would you consider meditation to be mindfulness, to think about your thoughts in its rawness?
I think that meditation could be a activity within the framework of mindfulness. Absolutely.
Okay. Mo, like what are some type of therapies we already basically come to the conclusion that we are living in a nation that's suffering from psychosis. It's just a symptom. If you have a patient who's suffering from psychosis, what is your job at that point in time?
Yeah, so for me, I'm trying to assess the illness.
Okay.
Psychosis just helps me to identify what the illness is. That's just a symptom. But I'm really trying to assess, what are you really sick from? What's really making you sick? And so my job is to process and go through the therapy to figure out, what is it that's causing you mental pain? What is it that's causing this disorder? And so psychosis could be a clue to get me closer to the root. But it's not psychosis alone that's going to be able to do it. I'm pretty sure if you are, demonstrating psychosis, then you're displaying a plethora of other illnesses, I'm pretty sure. Sorry, symptoms as well. So, psychosis, which could be the incorporation of hallucinations, you're having psychotic episodes, you're seeing things that aren't necessarily true. That will give me clues to say, okay. So when you see this, then the line of questions begin to unfold. And I'm saying, when you see this particular activity, how do you respond to it? And I begin to, chart and identify, sort of, track their responses. That gets me closer to what the possible illness could be. But psychosis means you're in acute. You're already in. You remember those three stages I talked about: of postrum, acute, recovery.
Mhm.
Psychosis lives in the acute place, which is, oh man, there's an illness that hasn't been treated and it's manifesting in a way where it's bad. That's
Mhm.
why you're in psychosis, because you're untreated.
Mm. Mm.
So we need to sit down and figure out what's really going on underneath, because your symptoms are just robust.
You mentioned psychotherapy in the
Mhm.
past. When you see these symptoms, is psychotherapy a way for you to diagnose or treat a patient?
Absolutely, because the beauty of psychotherapy, it's the treatment of mental behavior. It helps you kind of identify those issues that are going on with you, and then it begins to co-treat behaviors that do not serve you.
Mhm.
And so I think that psychotherapy, I think, is really, really, a fantastic practice, especially those who, I have a lot of colleagues who their expertise is in psychotherapy and they've seen some pretty impactful work. I like going through all the series of therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, these different behavioral therapies I like to facilitate before we go to just giving them, a pill or two for the particular issue.
Mhm.
Let's go through some therapy first. Then we'll get to, if it's that clinical, then we get into, diagnosing you and treating you with pills.
So, what could be a therapy for someone who is constantly being fed a negative narrative?
So, all of us are being fed negative narratives. You're referring to a negative narrative about ourselves,
Mhm.
correct?
Mhm.
So I think that can fall into reappropriation therapy, where you're helping someone go through a process by which you're assessing sort of the vehicles that they assume, or those, I'm sorry, you're assessing the vehicles that typically is utilized for those persons to get self-worth,
Mhm.
and you identify them to say, hey, because you can't take one thing and not replace it with something else. So what you're trying to do is help identify the vehicles that are feeding one's identity,
Mhm.
and then you're helping them to say, hey, this doesn't serve you, let me take this and replace it with something else that serves you.
Mhm.
You're just reappropriating sort of the vehicles that feed one's identity, if that makes sense.
What's something that an individual can do at home if they have a really low value of self? What are some practices a person could use in order to change that perception of themselves?
I think that first I would love to see those. I would love for those clients to come to my office.
Right.
But when you said things that you can do at home
Mhm.
about having low self-worth,
Mhm.
and I do think that when one is struggling with low self-worth, I don't think that's something they can pull themselves out of.
Mhm.
I don't think it's a home kit.
Mhm.
I think that you do need to have a mental health or practitioner, therapist, counselor to help that particular person work through, because low self-worth is so deep.
Mhm.
And depending on the population, when you talk about especially people of color, their low self-worth can be rooted to so many things. And so I do think that some folks, some would say, there's a population where you say, oh, well, you must have grown up hearing negative things about yourself, or you don't think you're attractive. And we diagnose the person with all these different issues that they may have experienced.
Mhm.
Okay, well, those are probably the easier ones, because you can say all of these particular activities contributed to one's self-worth. But then you have another constituent, you have another population where they heard great things about themselves. They've seen great things in their lives. They've done great things, and they still suffer with self-worth, low self-worth. And so it could be something that they've watched. It could be something that ticked where they were good, and then their whole psyche. So it could be something clinically going on. So that I can't really give you a home remedy
Mhm.
for that, because every client could be different. Every
And
client could be suffering in a different way. It's rooted to, it could be a mental illness, it could be psychological disorder. It could be something traumatic that occurred. The list has to go on. I would have to probably speak with the patient.
When I hear that, again, this is a history. You have to know someone's history in order to
Yeah,
help
it's not a
them.
one
It was
size
different.
fits all formula especially when it comes to mental health. It's a little bit more abstract.
Okay. And now, a method someone can use at home if they suffer from paranoia.
Now that could be, once again, that could be something mental.
Mhm.
That could be a mental disorder. Because paranoia also, that fits within the remedies of psychosis as well. That could be, again, another characteristic that's attached to psychosis. It could be paranoia syndrome. It could be a result of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So, you know what I mean? So there's those characteristics could be attached. I would just need to go through a thorough chart, a thorough exploration through one's background, but they're all tied kind of in one big nest together.
And how about at home, if someone could try something at home as far as lack of empathy? Some people have a lack of empathy for others. They can't put themselves in another person's shoes. Is there something people can do from home that could help them with that?
So lack of empathy could also be attached to some traumatic occurrence that is actually happened or is actually happening to a person. Because sometimes when you're not empathetic, when you talk about empathetic, it's really the ability to feel, to thrive. And so if you're in a painful situation, one of the best coping mechanisms is to become numb.
Mm.
And so I wouldn't really necessarily have empathy when I'm basically only trying to deal with my own pain. Hence why I have to become numb, because if I feel, I'm gonna be a complete disaster. So when you talk about the idea of these kind of home remedies, I'm very hesitant in terms of giving you the home remedies because I do think there needs to be a trained, certified practitioner to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the narrative from our original request, which is you can do this by yourself, stay home. And what I'm encouraging people of color is that I want to dismantle home kits,
Right.
home mental kits. I need us to get to those like ourselves who study, train to help pull these things that need to be rooted out so that one can be healed and pushed to a place of stronger mental hygiene.
Mm-hmm.
The home kits, especially with people of color, we've known this for years. You fall down, drink some water. You have a cough, drink some water. I'm feeling sick, drink some. No, we need to do away with these home kits.
Mm-hmm.
I can give you a list of things you should do in terms of being mindful, but I still want to encourage you to be open to counseling and therapy as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree. Completely agree. It's the reason why I asked those questions, Mo, because basically I wanted the audience to understand that you need a mental health professional like Mo. We're in a Zoom chat right now. There has to be a way to connect with your mental health therapist.
Yeah.
And you need it. Think about the history of our people. They were enslaved, men and women both raped. They were freed, never acknowledged. We're always made to be tough. We lack empathy for each other in these streets.
We do. And there's resources.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to, there's so many resources, especially for us, for men, men of color in particularly. There's resources for us to come out. I hear all the time, I can't afford it, or my insurance doesn't cover it. I'm telling you, even if when you come and identify a therapist or counselor that you connect with, they have access to resources that can even give you almost nearly free sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's an old adage I always say, you have not because you ask not. Reach out. You never know what you find. Reach out and see what type of financial structure or services or grants that's permitted. But I really want us to make our mental hygiene a priority, like we do, physical hygiene with our bodies. Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And mental hygiene, even right now, needs to be a precedence, needs to be top priority as we mitigate through COVID-19, as we go through this transition once again, as we deal with this pandemic, as we deal with this economy. the shifts and turns of our leadership, et cetera, we got to get our minds, we have to be centered because there's so many things coming at us and there's more to come. There's more calamity to come. And if we do not make this mental hygiene a priority, you're going to see many more dead, not as a result of COVID-19. You're going to see it as a result of suicide. People dropping dead because their mental bandwidth is at its capacity. So that's my urgent call for our audience tonight.
Agreed. And, you said something that's really key. Before we can get to any solution base, we have to address the original trauma to figure out what we need, our basic needs. Our basic needs. I asked Mo a series of questions that relate to our history as a people. And now, when I'm looking at our nation, whether you're white or black, we are all sick, extremely sick. And in order to move forward so we can all connect, we need to connect with Mo or any mental health professional. I consider Mo to be one of the best out there, but you need to contact somebody right now and get to the bottom of our situation. We need to figure out as a people what we need to do to connect at this very moment. And Dr. Mo, you have anything to add before we close out of this segment?
I would just like to say to the audience is that I would truly like to encourage everyone during this time to be gentle with one another, demonstrate patience. This social distance concept to me is feeding the notion of us just not even seeing each other as human. I'm in a supermarket and I just held the door for someone. And the lady said, don't hold the door, it's social distance. I just wanted to hold the door so you can come in. But she was more so concerned about the virus getting to her through me or if I was too close. Just these concepts of us just not even working together. And so I know for sure that people don't necessarily want to know, do you hear me or do you feel me? But they really want to know, do you see me? And, are you hearing what I'm saying? And so I do think that we just need to be more cognizant that we're all in this together, black, white, whatever it is. And one of the greatest ways to overcoming COVID-19, I just hope, audience, I hope we don't miss the lesson that COVID-19 is the vehicle to not only to slow us down, but COVID-19 is the vehicle to help us look at the very thing that we find when we slow down. And we're going to find some dirty things. I would hate for people to miss out on the opportunity that you were slowed down and showed various things that you need to work on mentally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, and you didn't take the time during this intermission to work on it. Look at COVID-19 as the tool, the vehicle that slowed our lives down so that we can get back to wellness. And so one of the ways as a solution of getting back to wellness is mindfulness. And so once again, I can't stress, I want all of us to consider being gentle to one another, kind, knowing we're all in this together, and to be willing to do the work for our own mental stability. So those are my final words.
And I felt that, the other day, I called you the other day because I was pumping my gas and it was a young man. And I don't think I ever going to forget this young man. He asked to pump my gas for me. And I told him no, because I was, again, concerned for his safety as well as my own. And I went to go pay for my gas in this A+ on 52nd Street in Philadelphia. And the same young man was wearing his surgical mask as well and his gloves. He held the door open for me. And I paid for my gas, and then walking out, I gave the young man $2. Just because if he's out here right now asking to pump gas or holding doors open, he's doing that so he can try to earn a living or earn some money for his family. We live in Philadelphia where 200,000 people living in deep poverty. I think if I didn't have the conversations I have with Dr. Mo to get my mental health better, I wouldn't be able to empathize with this young man or recognize that the situation is way bigger than me and that at this very moment, we all need to connect. You can't always give, but you can put things in place so that you are in a position to give to someone in your community to lift them up. We need to be doing this on a regular basis, every day. You need to be able to empathize, to connect. You need to be able to go into a room and be alone with our thoughts and analyze them and pick them apart and figure out what we need. Before all that, you need to speak with a mental health professional. All the symptoms are right there. It's deadly. Our president is a prime example of, he has all the symptoms of psychosis. And as a nation, that trickles down to us. We've been going through it forever. Now it's a time, right now should be a time for us to really address this issue right now. This is why mental health should be on the top of your list. And Dr. Mo, I'm always appreciative of all of these meetings and these conversations, because you're not only a good friend of mine, you're actually helping elevate my consciousness.
Thank you.
And that's one of the best gifts I could ever have achieved, I could ever have been given by someone like yourself and my wife and the people in my circle.
Okay.
And I really hope that our audience is able to do the same, because we need it. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And with that being said, Philadelphia, America, it is always personal in Philadelphia. Again, we love you.